Hey everybody, I hope you're all doing well. Everything's going okay on your end. I've got just a short little introductory video here for you on the next chapter, our last chapter of the semester, chapter 7 on normative ethical theory. So I just wanted to kind of set up the kinds of theories that we're going to be looking at in this chapter and to give you some key points to keep in mind as you work through each of the videos on each of the three moral theories in this chapter. So some of this we've already covered in the introduction to moral philosophy and meta-ethics video at the beginning of the last section, but I just wanted to reiterate some of what I talked about there and to expand on it before you get to work on learning about utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, or respect for persons ethics, and Aristotle's virtue ethics. So a bit of a recap, but also a little bit of new information here. So this chapter is on normative ethical theory, right? So we've already talked a little bit about the difference between a meta-ethical statement about the, or a meta-ethical claim about the nature of morality. Is it objective or is it relative? Are there any universal prescriptive truths? Or are there no objective or universal prescriptive truths? Well, those are meta-ethical statements about the foundations or nature of morality. Normative ethical theories are prescriptive theories. They attempt to identify and defend through an argument, right, some standard, some moral standard of right conduct or good living. And so that's the basic idea of a normative ethical theory. So if you remember, previously, we talked about these three different branches of moral philosophy. So we looked at meta-ethics in the last chapter, divine command theory, ethical non-objectivism, ethical objectivism, moral relativism are all theories that deny or affirm objectivity and universality with regard to prescriptive statements. And then a normative ethical theory, the traditional ones anyway, and the mainstream normative ethical theories in philosophy, they all presuppose some version of moral objectivity or another. So they're assuming objectivism and then going out and attempting to identify and defend what they think is the correct, objectively true, prescriptive standard for guiding conduct. So that's the basic, again, the basic relationship between meta-ethics and normative ethical theory. We're going to look at three basic theories in this chapter. And again, so whereas the theories here are slightly different than the kinds of theories we looked at in the meta-ethics chapter, here, again, the task of a normative or prescriptive ethical theory, what your textbook just calls moral theory, is to propose a theory that answers one of these two questions. What ought I do, or how should I live? Right? So what these theories are, again, attempting to do is to identify a standard that helps us answer one of those questions, either the what ought I do question or the how should I live question, or maybe putting that second question in a slightly different way, what kind of person should I be? Right? And so in this chapter, we're going to look at three influential ethical theories in philosophy. By influential, I mean influential in Western philosophy and academic philosophy. And those three theories are virtue ethics. Aristotle's going to be our example there. Deontology and respect for persons ethics. Those are moral theories that come from Kant. Immanuel Kant is the father of those theories. And then utilitarianism is our last. Actually, it's going to be a third theory, but it's going to be the first one we cover at the beginning of the chapter. So again, in normative ethical theories, these are theories of right conduct or good living, right? They're, again, trying to identify and defend a standard that helps us answer one of those two questions. What ought I do, or how should I live? So here's kind of just the definition then of a normative ethical theory. When philosophers talk about normative, they typically have something different in mind than might be in the mind of a social scientist. Somebody in the social sciences, where norm or normative might be referred to the average or commonplace, most commonplace behavior of people. When philosophers, especially moral philosophers, talk about normative, ethical theory, what they have in mind is a prescriptive theory. So whereas the social sciences might be attempting to describe the norm in terms of behavior, of a population or society or something like that, a normative ethical theory attempts to identify, not simply describe how people behave, in fact, how they behave, and thereby identifying the norm behavior or the normal behavior. What they're attempting to do is identify a prescriptive standard. So here, normative means prescriptive, right? It is expressing a value judgment about what we ought to do or how we should live, or what counts as morally right or wrong conduct, right? So again, thinking of these theories and thinking of some terms that were introduced in the last chapter between impermissible, permissible, and obligatory forms of action, a normative ethical theory attempts to identify a prescriptive standard, a normative standard that helps us distinguish and provides a guide to distinguishing between permissible, impermissible, or prohibited, and obligatory actions, or good and bad forms of character traits. So here's an example of a normative or prescriptive standard that I'm sure most of all of you are already familiar with. It's common to the world's main religions. It's the golden rule, right? So the golden rule is an example of a prescriptive or moral standard here. And when I'm talking about moral statements or prescriptive statements, I have in mind statements that express a value judgment, or that prescribe behavior in some way. Do this, don't do that, that kind of thing, right? So the golden rule provides us a standard to guiding action. It says that I should treat others as I want them to treat me, right? So if I don't like it when people randomly punch me in the face, then I ought to walk around refraining from randomly punching people in the face, right? So based on how I want others to treat me, then I know that it's impermissible to randomly punch people in the face, right? So that's the golden rule. Treat others as you would want them to treat you. And it gives us, again, a standard of conduct, a standard of right conduct. Now, that's a very common one that we all know, but that's not the one that we're going to focus on in this chapter. We're going to look at 3 other moral theories that are influential in philosophy. So again, this is the first one that we'll look at is utilitarianism. The normative standard, or the prescriptive standard central to utilitarianism, is called the utility principle, or sometimes the greatest happiness principle. And it says that we ought to perform those actions or follow those social policies, depending on which version of utilitarianism we're looking at. So we either ought to perform those actions or follow those social policies that would maximize overall happiness, that would maximize overall well-being, right? And by overall well-being, what the utilitarians mean is not my individual overall well-being, like over the course of my life, but considering only my happiness. It's everybody's happiness, right? So it's concerned with the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's another way in which that standard is sometimes put. And then we're going to look at Kantian ethics. Kantian ethics takes different directions, but central to all of them was Kant's idea of the categorical imperative. He put that categorical imperative different ways, but the basic idea of a categorical imperative is an imperative, a command, right? An obligation that's binding on everyone. That's the categorical part. So one way in which Kant put the categorical imperative was that I ought to act only on those maxims, those principles of action that can be rationally willed as a universal law without contradiction. So if when I universalize the principle that I'm acting on and it generates a contradiction, that means it's morally prohibited. If it passes that test, then it's at least morally permissible to operate on it and possibly obligatory. Another way in which Kant put the categorical imperative, a different version of it, was the humanity or end in itself formula. And it says that I'm always supposed to treat humanity, whether in myself or in others, always is a intrinsic end. It is valuable in and of itself and never is a mere means, right? And so there's the idea of respect for persons. What I'm supposed to respect about them is their autonomy, and I'm not supposed to use them for my own purposes, right? So we'll talk about that in the middle part of this chapter. And then the last view that we look at is going to be Aristotle's version of virtue ethics. He gives us a classical and very influential version of virtue ethics. There are others, but he gives us one of the main influential ones. And he identified the golden mean, not the golden rule, but the golden mean. So whereas the golden rule says treat others as you would want them to treat you, the golden mean helps pick out a virtue or an excellence of character as opposed to a vice, a negative character trait. So the golden mean says that a virtue is a mean between two extremes, one of excess or too much of the trait, and the other is a deficiency, too little of the trait. And so courage, for example, is a mean between cowardice, the deficiency, and recklessness, the excess. And so those are the three basic theories that we'll look at in this chapter. While you're working through these different theories, you need to keep in mind a couple of key points of contrast and comparison, and a couple of questions that you should be asking yourself about each of these theories. First, is the theory an act-based theory or a character-based theory? Act-based theories typically take their point of departure from that "what ought I do" question. They're concerned with providing a standard of right conduct, where we're talking about discrete actions, as opposed to a theory that is focused not on the action that an individual is performing, but the character traits of the person performing the action. So that's like Aristotle's virtue ethics, and two act-based theories are like deontology and utilitarianism. And then we have teleological versus non-teleological theories. Teleology means ends, purpose, or goal, right? And so some moral theories, they emphasize the idea that what makes conduct right or wrong is whether or not that conduct, whether that action produces a result or not, whether it achieves a goal or not, whether it helps further that goal or not. So utilitarianism is a theory that's teleological. It says that right conduct is whatever conduct will maximize overall happiness, as opposed to a theory like deontology, which doesn't base right conduct on whether or not the conduct promotes a particular end or not, like happiness for the greatest number of people, but simply, or rather, whether the maxim of the action can be willed as a universal law of nature without regard to the negative or positive consequences of that action. Similarly, we have consequentialist or non-consequentialist theories. So a consequentialist theory, or consequentialism in moral philosophy, is that what's morally relevant about an action are the consequences of its action, as opposed to a theory that thinks what's morally relevant about an action are not the consequences, but the intention or maxim that was being acted on. So again, utilitarianism is an example of a consequentialist theory, and Kantian deontology is an example of a non-consequentialist theory. Then we'll, each of the moral theories will look at, that they will posit something as intrinsically valuable or valuable in and of itself, regardless of whether it has instrumental value or not. And then it will posit other things as being merely instrumentally valuable. So something that's instrumentally valuable, is a non-moral example here, is like money. I don't want money for its own sake. I want money because it allows me to do other stuff. It has an exchange value, right? So its value is in its use, right? As opposed to something that is intrinsically valuable. So a good example of a relatively uncontroversial example of something that's intrinsically valuable, at least according to one of these moral theories, is the idea of a person. Right? So sorry about that. That's my news alert going off on my phone. I forgot to silence my phone here before I started. Sorry about that. Again, some theories will posit the idea that rational persons, right, are what's intrinsically valuable and therefore shouldn't be used as a mere means. Other theories like utilitarianism will posit pleasure understood in a particular way as intrinsically valuable. And then we have the issue of a criteria for moral standing or moral consideration. So I've got here a computer mouse. This is actually my mouse. It's not one that was issued to me by LSU or by my employer. So I'm willing to bet, even though some of you might think it imprudent of me or unwise because it's a perfectly good and useful and functioning mouse, some of you might think it's imprudent to break it if I wanted to, but you probably wouldn't have a moral problem with me breaking my own property, right? Even if it seems like it's not a wise idea, because I could be using that thing if I hadn't broken it, right? On the other hand, so in other words, this object seems to be lacking some properties that other beings might have that makes them intrinsically valuable or morally considerable, such that I have to worry about, morally speaking, what I do or how I treat that other being for moral reasons. So, for example, this object, this entity here, it's just a thing, right? It has instrumental value to me, but it doesn't have intrinsic value to me. It can't feel pain or pleasure, right? And it lacks the capacity for rationality. And so those are two examples of criteria for moral standing. So different theories will have different criteria for that. Again, it's what kinds of properties or characteristics does a thing or an object or a being need to have in order for it to matter, morally speaking, such that I have to worry about what I'm gonna do to it or how I'm gonna treat it. And then one last thing to worry about with regard to these different moral theories. You probably see my cat here coming into the shot. This is Sazerac. He likes to keep me company while I'm doing my lecture videos here. A last thing to worry about with regard to each of these moral theories is whether or not that theory has a role for happiness or not. Some theories, moral theories, will emphasize and give a central place to happiness, although they might think of happiness in different ways or conceive of happiness in different ways. Other theories, they won't really, happiness won't figure centrally to them at all. So keep an eye out for that. And when a theory does place a premium on happiness or have a central role for happiness in the theory, you want to think about how they've defined happiness for sure, because there are different ways of thinking about what that term is, and certainly that's going to be an issue in this chapter. And as we've been doing all semester long, we need to worry, well, not worry about, we're going to use pop culture examples of this stuff. And so I'm going to use Rick and Morty here. There are 3 episodes of Rick and Morty that you want to be sure and watch in conjunction with the moral theories. So the first theory you're going to look at is utilitarianism. You need to watch the autoerotic assimilation episode of Rick and Morty for that one. And then think about how that episode illustrates some utilitarian ideas, right? And then for respect for persons ethics, there you need to watch the Rick Potion number 9 episode of Rick and Morty, and think about how that episode kind of illustrates some ideas central to that theory. You might worry there about whether, according to the humanity or end in itself version of the categorical imperative, whether some people in the episode are violating that principle in some way. And then lastly, you need to watch the Whirly-Durly conspiracy episode of Rick and Morty. And there we're going to worry about the character traits that Jerry has, and as well as the character traits that Rick has, and how those match up with some of Aristotle's ideas about the golden mean and human flourishing, eudaimonia, his idea of happiness, and whether or not Jerry and or Rick are likely to flourish or achieve human flourishing according to Aristotle's view, based on whether or not they they possess any more virtues than they do vices. And so that'll be a fun way, I hope, of kind of illustrating some of these ideas and these moral theories and getting you to think about how each of those moral theories would evaluate different sorts of actions or forms of conduct or character traits. All right, that'll do it for this little introductory video. Up next, take a look at the utilitarian video. Hope y'all are all doing well and staying healthy and getting through the material as best as you can. As always, I will hold a review session for this chapter and at the end of it, and do kind of a live Q&A about the material, as well as you can always post in the forum or send me an email with your questions about anything that's coming up for you in this chapter. Hope y'all are well, and we'll see you soon.